Did I win this argument?
Yes, you did. I think you won the argument. You won the argument, guys. All right, cheers to the start of 100 days. So here's a fucking context, right? We're building this free company. It's supposed to empower creators, right? So we're supposed to give as much commission to creators as possible. This guy here, the prodigal son of Apple. So we were talking about Fan House, and Fan House had Jasmine Rice, who was this Twitter influencer since she was in high school. She
a proper
posted.
Influencer, not like us.
Yeah.
Trying hard.
We're totally not influencers. Jasmine Rice, proper influencer. On Twitter, she was Apple is exploiting creators and exploiting the App Store, and 30% commission on everything, and they didn't want to charge those commissions. So they said that they're already giving 10%, and if they do 30%, it's going to cripple the company and cripple the creators as well. So in our team, we were thinking, should we join them on that thing, or should we agree with Apple on this thing? And now, we have 11 people on the team. Every single person sided with Jasmine Rice and Fan House. And there was one dissenter, this guy. And today we're going to sort it out. All right.
When you enter a country
Yeah.
and you know their laws,
Yeah.
just because you don't like them
Yeah.
doesn't mean they're violating something, right? Think of London right now. They have a congestion charge of what, 15 or 20 pounds or something every day.
Yeah.
You know the rules.
Yeah.
You cannot like them.
Yes.
But someone has to pay for the roads.
Right.
Someone has to pay for infrastructure. Someone invested billions into employees, into infrastructure, into making sure every single piece of content that we consume is secure.
Yeah.
On the App Store.
Right.
That is not a free lunch.
Yeah.
It has to come from somewhere, and it's not just something that's just made up from thin air, right?
So I buy that argument as an argument for the existence of taxes, and in the case of Apple, the existence of commissions. I think that's right. But my question is, why does it justify the amount of commission that Apple is taking? So imagine if tomorrow, the government of France told you we're going to do 70% income taxes. Now, it's quite plausible that you could migrate to somewhere else. Like you could go and say, I'm gonna, move to another country in the EU and get lower taxes. I can move to Miami, I can move to, Seattle, right? There are no income taxes, it's awesome. But in the case of Apple, you basically have nowhere to go. The only alternative you have is for Android, and you basically miss out on an extremely large market that Apple devices are covering, right? So what justifies Apple to take a 30% commission versus 10% or 20%?
I think this comes down to the fundamental definition of fair. Right? Apple has set 30% from the get-go.
Yes.
It's not like, oh, whoa, hey, surprise, it's 30%.
Right.
And it's not like you didn't know the rules before you decided to spend millions developing an app. You knew the rules going in.
Yeah.
So, why is someone complaining about rules they knew from the get-go that's been there from the very start, that's also industry standard across digital media?
Well, across the two app stores that exist.
No, this is across digital books, movies, games, music, not just Android and...
But does Amazon take a 30% commission on everything they sell on the platform?
For all digital goods, basically, yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So how much is the commission?
Yeah. I mean, it varies depending on some people have custom contracts.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, it's 30% is pretty flat. PlayStation Store, 30%.
Yeah.
But no one complains because
Yeah.
it's not making enough of a buzz, right? And so, who's to say 30% is or isn't fair? Do I feel like my 40-something% income tax here is fair?
Yeah.
I mean, I can argue it's not fair, but I also know the rules, and I have to play by the rules.
So that's the hard part about this question, because I agree with you that definitely what Apple's done to build the infrastructure deserves at least some amount of commission. I also agree that if you know the foundations of what the commission actually costs before you start developing, that's a very obvious thing that you should stick to. But I don't think that means no one has a right to criticize. Right? So if I migrate to the UK because I love the UK, I love the country, I love the opportunities there, I've got a great job there, and I know all the laws up front, that does mean I shouldn't be surprised that the income tax is what it is, but it doesn't mean I can't complain about the fucking income tax, right? I could very well say this is not legitimate. So the question is, why is Apple's level of commission legitimate when a lot of the times when you think about what FanHouse is talking about, when a consumer spends on what a FanHouse creator has created, they're spending on the creator's content. They're not spending on anything else. They're not spending on Apple. They're not spending on even FanHouse. They're spending because that influencer has created something worthwhile. Now, FanHouse has contributed to some extent to creating the platform for them to create that content. Apple has also created the infrastructure and the devices necessary for that to happen. But both of them, in my mind, have basically offered roughly the same amount of value, right? And so, but FanHouse is taking 10% and Apple is taking 30%. So what's making the difference between the two?
Take a step back.
Yeah.
30%, you can say it's too high or too low even.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
sure.
Why shouldn't it be 70%?
Sure.
For example, right?
Yeah.
But to say, hey, it's not fair, I think it's more. I think it's more just this type of societal self-entitlement that we have.
Yeah.
Oh, big company with a lot of cash pile. It's not fair. Why do they deserve this much, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And
like, why do we have billionaires?
Yeah, why do we have billionaires? Why is it so unfair? And I think that's at a deeper core level. That's where this thinking is coming from.
Yeah.
And to say it's not fair, there's no real judgment of value here. Because if you look at the intrinsic value that goes into 30%, they might actually be underpricing.
Yeah.
Because if you look at what they invested at the very get-go, before they even knew this was going to take off, 30% is finally making up for all the billions invested into this entire ecosystem.
Yeah.
Making the roads straight, paved, people have internet. It's like having a street where you have a restaurant and making sure that restaurant is thoroughly checked.
Yeah.
Cars don't run into you.
Yeah.
And street lights actually run. So it's all those things that we think, oh, is it fair? They're taking more than FanHouse.
Yeah.
I think simply that framing is what's creating this idea that it's not fair.
Right.
If FanHouse took equal amounts, does that change the discussion?
I mean, it probably does, right? Like, so if you think about OnlyFans take 20%, and a lot of creators are saying that that's exploitative. Patreon is sticking to 5 to 10%, but obviously it's not been sustainable for them as a model. They're losing tons of money all the time. And YouTube is taking 45% effectively of all the ad revenue they're getting. So there is a big change in the narrative. Right now people are saying marketplaces are actually exploitative, they're taking away from the creators that actually people spend money on, and they shouldn't be taking that much money. So there is a big narrative change here. But if we step back a bit, so I get that the debate on the specific number, like what's fair, 30% or 45% or 50%, that's a hard debate to have because really no one can really quantify the contribution that each of these platforms is making. But if we step back a bit, the fundamental problem here is that Apple has so much market power that they're able to restrict essentially 2 billion devices around the world to only have one app store. There's no other way a consumer can securely download another application because they can't jailbreak the iPhone, right? If they do, then it's extremely insecure. There's no other way within Apple's regulations that someone else could start another app store and download apps from that. And so that feels to me to be like market dominant behavior, right? You're basically saying to someone, you bought my device, now everything you consume on that device is subject to a tax from me, and you have no alternative. Like there's nothing else you could do. Like, why is that justified?
So I think we think it's market dominance only because it finally became successful and big. Mm-hmm. Apple has not changed their mindset since they nearly were bankrupt.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
No one was saying, oh, it's market dominance back when they had the exact same rules.
Yes.
Back when they were a tiny company that was going to go bankrupt.
Right.
I think the narrative has shifted dramatically now to be anti-big tech because they just happen to be big now, so it's considered dominance. But they've been playing by the same they've been setting the same rules basically from the get-go.
Yeah.
And their success is voted by the people.
Yeah.
People could have said, no, hell no to this. I'm going
Right.
to get an Android. I'm going to get something open source I can play flush around it. But they've set the rules, and yet people enjoy that experience more, and
Yeah.
they voted with their wallet.
Yeah.
So, I mean, is it their fault that they created something that actually is amazing and that people actually spend money on, that they constantly vote for with their money?
Well, they're voting for it with their money, but then they're not really getting a choice of how the downstream impact of the money that's used to purchase that device actually creates, right? And your argument here, so I get where you're coming from, but this is no different from saying any market dominant player is only dominant because they're big. Yes, right? That's by definition what's happened. They become extremely successful and they've leveraged their competitive position to become even more successful. And if we think back to 2007, imagine a situation where in 2007, Steve Jobs announces the iPhone. In the following iteration, he releases iPhone 3G, and he says the App Store is now going to be available. But he also says anyone can set up an App Store. Anyone can make money and create apps in all kinds of different formats, right? I highly doubt that Apple would have become as market dominant in the software mobile devices as they have become, right? It's the same argument that killed Bill Gates and Microsoft back in the 1990s, where effectively what they did was they bundled all their software into one operating system. They said the moment you buy Windows, you get Office, you get Internet Explorer, right? All these types of things, and that gave them a massive heads up compared to everything else that was on those platforms. And Apple's done exactly the same thing with the App Store. And
One thing I'll put there, I think the case there was unfair towards Microsoft. Nothing was wrong with bundling, and I think by default, people uninstall Internet Explorer anyways. It's terrible.
Now they do. And by the way, that's super important, because you're saying they're voting by choice, but they had the choice on Windows, right? They had Internet Explorer, and they could have downloaded any other browser, and still Internet Explorer remained like the dominant browser player despite being the worst product for years, right? Like it got to until pretty much 2010 when Chrome came along that it really challenged them.
So in the App Store, are there no alternatives to basically every default stock app?
There is no alternative to another app store. You can download different apps for different types of verticals.
Yeah.
But there is no alternative to the App Store.
So as a consumer though, if you knew that going in, why are people still buying iPhones?
Well, I may be buying the iPhone for all kinds of other reasons, right? Like the device is more stable, I love the operating system and how simple it is, I love the design, all sorts of things. I may be buying for all kinds of reasons, but certainly not for the lack of alternatives to app stores, right? Like that's not what's driving my decision. Like it's if I'm buying a phone, I'm not saying I want 10 different app stores. But in the same way, when you buy a laptop, you're not saying I want like 10,000 different browsers. That's not the main buying incentive. But that doesn't excuse the fact that you've restricted consumer choice down the line. If you actually made it possible for someone to buy something for the device's value and then struggle with what goes down the line, right?
So if a consumer knows all this, and they actually care enough about this issue,
they would stop buying iPhones.
They would stop buying iPhones, but they don't care enough about it to not buy iPhones.
Well, but then, okay, so if I put this in a very stark example alternatively with the same logic, right? I tell you, you can become a slave to me, right? I can enslave you. And I can control every choice you make. If you don't become enslaved by me, I will kill you, right? That's the alternative. Now, you don't care enough about your enslavement versus death. And therefore, you decide, okay, I'm going to choose being enslaved. And now what you're saying is, if they cared enough about being enslaved, they would have killed themselves, right? But then that's not true. Because even though there are multiple layers of choices here, the choices that matter are still the ones that, there's still relative differences in the choices you make down the line, right? So the fact that in my purchase decision for Apple, I didn't care enough about, whether the App Store is diverse enough for me to not buy a device, that doesn't necessarily mean that I would only pursue one type of App Store over the other, right? Like my device choice is not driven purely by the App Store on its own.
So what you're saying is you made the calculation, the trade-off.
Yes.
And it's not enough of an issue for you to.
It's not the decisive issue, yes.
Yes.
But it doesn't necessarily mean that you can now restrict my choices in every other way. Right? The fact that this was not the single biggest issue that would stop me from buying something doesn't mean that you can restrict my choices within the choices I've made.
Why do you accept restrictions then? Is it because the choices that are made for you are better?
So if you can prove a causation between the App Store and what it provides to basically Apple just being the better device in every single way, then I kind of buy it, right? And that's why Apple is spending so much effort talking about security and stability and all those other things, because that's not what matters. But if you think about it, the Mac doesn't have a singular App Store, right? It has, you can download apps from anywhere. And that's not been a problem in differentiating their devices at all. Like, it doesn't seem to me that that is the deciding factor. In fact, a lot of the times it's actually, the phone and the specifications of the phone and the design of the overall operating system. That's what's making the difference.
Is the consumer benefiting from this?
Well, so, okay, you used the government example at the beginning of this to talk about governing legitimacy, right? Taxes versus commissions and so on. So let's take the same thing, but put it in the context of a democratic choice in a political election. Imagine a free and fair democratic election, and you have two parties, right? And one party says, it's a bunch of super incompetent people. Like, they're terrible, they don't know what they're doing, but they say, I'm going to give you maximum freedom. Right? It's kind of like the Android of
Sure.
elections, right? Yeah. I'll give you tons of freedom.
Yeah, you can catch all the STDs you want.
Yeah, you can do whatever you want. Like, we'll just have a complete chaos on the streets.
No masks, no vaccines,
nothing.
Yeah.
Like,
that's
freedom, that's what it's about, right? Then you have the alternative, which is a conservative party, right, that says to you, I'm going to control every fucking thing in your life, but I am, like, incredibly competent, right? Everyone in this party knows what they're doing, they're governing really well, and so on and so forth. Now, in this election, 55% of people end up choosing the Conservative Party, and they win, right? And it's great, and it's amazing, and so on. Now, they are very competent. The level of freedom was not the deciding issue, like in this election, because the competence was so stark in difference that people were like, I would much prefer to have this Conservative Party in charge. But does this mean that the Conservative Party can then restrict the freedom of its people in every way possible? Right? Like, is it legitimate for them to do that? Because, sure, it was not the deciding issue, but that issue still has legitimacy. It's still pertinent, right? It's still important for people.
See, I think that's the differentiator. It's not in every single way possible.
Right.
In this example, they're basically saying, oh, you have to get water through one water company.
Sure. Yes.
Right. But everything else, you actually can do whatever you want.
Well, but that's not really true, because the App Store is so core to what the iOS device actually does. It's everything.
It is and it isn't.
Right.
I mean, a lot of apps people use don't even rely on these microtransactions to begin with.
Well, okay.
How many apps you use where you actually pay for something?
Well,
right?
Sure. Okay.
What's the
fair
last
enough.
app you use where you actually pay for something besides like?
And I guess like things like Uber and Deliveroo and all those other things don't really count in this, because you're actually not doing that.
So that freedom actually exists quite a lot. It's
Right.
just this tiny portion of it where
Right.
I think it gets the headlines very easily because they're attacking big tech companies. But to the most extent, like, people are getting an experience that I would argue is more enriched, more fluid between all your devices. And it's more secure. They can trust their payments are going through. And on the one-off case where they're actually spending more money and they're spending in a secure way, it happens to be in a more restricted way. I mean,
so maybe, okay, I get your argument there. And maybe this is no longer about how much of your experience is shaped by the App Store. It's really basically taxes. It's the same thing. It's like basically one party is saying to you, I would charge you 30% taxes on everything you do.
I would love to get 30%.
Right. Well, I mean, we're in a bloody welfare state, so that's different. And theoretically, I guess you could say the 30% is being reinvested in the infrastructure and the security of the system as well. So that kind of makes sense. But yeah, so basically it's taxes was not the deciding issue in the election. But now is it legitimate to tax at the rate that they do?
Well, okay, let's look at one more factor.
Yeah.
Right now we're looking at how much is being taken.
Right.
But let's look at how much is received.
Yeah.
Would you rather receive, just at a high level, would you rather receive what's left over,
Yeah.
let's say 70% of 100 million,
Yeah.
or would you rather receive 90% of 10 million?
Right.
That's the biggest differentiator. People are willing to spend more on a platform that they trust,
Yeah.
that typically allows them to have a more fluid personal experience. And yes, it might cost me more from a fee standpoint, but if I'm getting more business overall, that's not the worst thing, especially when you're doing digital content where a lot of it is just evergreen content that you're selling.
So I guess part of this is that people got very used to the fact that the World Wide Web itself is free. There's never been any commission. Tim Berners-Lee never created a financial model for it. And so there was never a tax for the internet. And you could argue that the web app version of any of the platforms we're talking about for the creator economy has been functioning completely fine without the mobile app, right? And so people are going, wait, on the web app, I have no tax. I'm earning, pretty much 90% of the money that I'm generating because, people want to see me as a creator. But then I go on this thing, I go on Patreon, I go on Fan House, and I download the mobile app version of that. Everything I sell on the mobile app is conceding 30% plus the other 10% on top of that, right? Now it feels like, how is this really different? Like, sure, the internet is much more of a wild west than mobile devices are. But nonetheless, most of us have been able to, walk around completely free. And you could say Mac OS and Windows are similar types of infrastructure that support, what they're doing, right? And the browser itself, of course, like Chrome, Safari, so on and so forth, they're still like a big part of the infrastructure, but they never charged a tax for that. So why does it legitimize Apple to now charge 30% on their App Store when they're not doing that on the web nor in the browsers at all?
They do charge on the Mac App Store.
Well, on the Mac App Store, it's a separate thing because, again, in the Mac App Store, there's choice. Right? You could basically leave that ecosystem when you want to, but the App Store is saying you can download apps on the internet wherever you want, but the App Store itself is guaranteed quality.
The App Store are a bit better.
Yeah.
Right? If you're downloading a random DMG file from some random website, that's not vetted by the App Store.
Well, but that's exactly right. Like on the desktop, there is that differentiation and there is still choice, but that commission seems legitimate, right? Because you're saying, hey, I'm vetted, I'm curated, it's better for you.
Fan House, right?
Yeah.
There's a ton of apps that allow monetization without forking over 30%.
Yes.
Why did you do that?
There's only one that's managed to escape it, which is Patreon. And it's very unclear why Patreon got to do it. Well, Amazon's slightly different, right? Like so all e-commerce, like if Amazon has to pay 30% commission, then Uber would have to, Deliveroo would have to, Uber Eats would have to, right?
So somehow Fan House did not take the model of monetization or of transactions as these other platforms.
Well,
but they opted for the version that's in-app, that's using Apple's payment ecosystem that they set up. Yeah. And now they don't want to play. They
don't want to pay anymore. Yeah.
Why didn't they just set up the payment process flows just like all these other apps?
Well,
or even do a progressive web
so
app.
It's unclear. It's unclear why Patreon is being accepted from this versus Fan House, right? Because they're doing exactly the same thing.
I think when one digs deeper into it, they actually aren't doing the same thing from a technical standpoint.
Right.
But that's for someone smarter than us to provide that. Leave comments on that if you're actually know what you're talking
if you actually care about this,
don't make some random just speaking out of your ass. So that's my take. Is there's actually something in terms of in the way that they're implementing the payments. That's determining why one is paying. I think this is all just a marketing exercise, to be honest. They thought, hey, what's the simplest way we can do it? Oh, let's just use this thing that we see, that they're doing in their API documentations. Oh, whoops, we have to pay 30% for this? Oh man, now we don't know how to, resolve this. It's like using Stripe and then figuring out, oh crap, we invested 2 months in doing this. Can we get?
I mean, it worked really well for them, so I got to give them kudos for that.
It's great at creating buzz, but at the same time, they have ex-Apple employees.
Right.
They should know better.
Yeah. They should have figured this out.
They should have figured this out. I mean, would I trade, like I said earlier, would I trade more revenue with a higher commission?
I mean,
or less revenue?
Well, so their complaint was as much about how Apple handled the issue as it was about the policy itself, right? Like Epic Games is about the policy itself, and I think there's lots of good arguments about why that legal case is kind of flawed, and they know they're going to probably lose the case. But FanHouse, they realized that Patreon did not have to pay the same amount of commission. It wasn't really clearly explained to them by Apple on what was being done differently, like what's changed, right? And
so let me defend that. I don't know why I keep defending someone that. A company doesn't have to reveal the terms and the setup of another company. That's very confidential. Like, am I going to reveal? Sure. Like, let's say I was working, and I was negotiating deals with the major publishers or something.
Sure.
Would I reveal the terms of another publisher that we have established? No, of course not. That's
definitely not.
Super privileged stuff.
Yeah.
And you actually void your contracts by revealing things that you shouldn't, right? So there's no way Apple's going to explain why, because then that explains what is built into someone else's contract.
Well, but then you should give consistency in your guidelines, right? Like you should explain why the way in which you qualify for either 30% commission or none is consistent across the platform.
Is that not explained? I actually think it's pretty well explained on the website.
Well, but then it becomes unclear when you come to that edge case, right, which is what's the difference between Patreon and FanHouse? Like if you're saying actually there's something in the commercial terms that makes this different, where they've signed a secret agreement with Apple where they get some benefits in the commission reduction because of what they've done. I get that. I think that's deeply unjust if that's happening between applications, but I get that. Right? But that's not what Apple's saying. Apple's saying we're applying our guidelines as they usually do. We're not going to tell you exactly what happened there, but that's different, right?
I think someone who actually can comb through the technical documentation and the guidelines should explain to us why.
Fair enough.
My hunch is that they're doing something technically different.
Yeah.
And they're going Patreon, that is.
Yeah.
It's going more the marketplace route, like an Uber-esque type, or like even DoorDash type of thing.
Yeah.
And that's how they're managing it.
Yeah.
And maybe we'll do it on my own if we figure out how. I'm going to argue for paying the commission if it means everyone can just simply, do a Face ID check and just check out a certain item, or pay for a certain item. Like the secure and seamlessness. Or secure experience.
I mean, it drastically increases your revenue. We know that that's true because every extra click is a massive reduction in potential revenue. Yeah.
So, Paco was saying earlier about outcome based.
Yeah.
For the creator, is there a worse outcome for them to have to, for them to get less revenue because their users are just frustrated with entering their credit card details every time? Even look at this place, right? Like, if we're ordering with a QR code, have to enter credit card details.
Yeah.
There's no way to pay with Apple Pay. There's like, probably 30% not giving up. But it's a terrible experience. Every time I order a beer, it has to go through this whole entire cycle. I get so fed up that I might just not order another round because it happens. So,
no, that's true.
I don't know. As a creator, if I'm, let's say, hypothetically, if I was a creator, I'm selling like this cool video that I recorded once. It's going to sell 1,000 times.
Yeah.
It's going to sell 100 times if I don't go through the Apple Pay route.
Yeah.
1,000 times if I do go.
Yeah.
That's my argument for it. And
that's fair enough.
I think people say 30% is too high, but there's so much marketing. I mean, it's basically like a marketing exercise that they pumped into making sure that the App Store drives that much revenue too, right?
Yeah.
People are just more likely to spend because they think, hey, this is actually a lot more secure.
Yeah.
I get cash back through my Apple Card.
Yeah.
Why not?
Yeah.
And I think the fair exercise we can never say something's fair or unfair because that's all in by either the holder.
Yeah.
And, some countries might think 50% tax is fair.
Yeah.
People there might argue it is or isn't, depending on what benefits them the most.
Yeah.
But I think that is a flawed argument that Penthouse is using.
Yeah. And I mean, it feeds into the classic. Well, actually, it's ironic because it's both a left and a right-wing argument, right?
Yeah.
It's a left-wing argument about liberation and fair compensation and stuff like that, but it's a right-wing argument about low taxes. So it's kind of both at the same time, and it's worked out very well for them.
Let me make a much larger, grander argument.
Yeah.
The more revenue Apple gets,
Yeah.
the better it is for the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ. The S&P 500 and NASDAQ are basically a heavy-weighted factor in almost everyone's retirement accounts around the world.
Yeah. Sure.
The more money Apple makes, does that actually trickle down to everyone around the world?
Well, I mean, if you argue that, then any successful company should just continually get bigger and bigger, even if they have market dominant positions, right?
Well, I mean,
because
not unless they're doing something terrible for the world, like if it's a cigarette company.
Well, then that would be pretty terrible, yes. But you're basically saying all the FANG companies should keep growing. That's essentially what it is.
Some of them exploit their employees. And,
Yeah.
I'm not going to get into that.
I mean, Apple exploits workers in Foxconn. The more iPhones they sell, the worse environmental degradation that happens, the more workers
I'm
commit
step in
suicide.
for that one because they don't do anything. They don't control what the workers do. It's Foxconn that does it.
But they are the most powerful company in the world, effectively. They could have stopped anything down the chain in their industrial supply chain if they wanted to. And Tim Cook himself is a supply chain guy, right? He should have control over this. He should be able to say, I don't want any workers to have to, commit suicide anymore because of the level of depression they've put under. Paying them more. Conceding a larger percentage of your profits in order to ensure that the workers of Foxconn actually get fairly compensated so they don't die.
The workers of Foxconn more.
Well, Apple could basically say, Foxconn, I won't accept contracts with you unless you fairly compensate your employees, and by fair compensation we mean X.
But that raises the cost of manufacturing.
Yes.
And raises the cost of the parts.
Yes.
So then it passes on to the consumer.
Well, you don't have to pass it on to the consumer if you're willing to concede a portion of your profit margin in order to ensure a more just outcome.
But then someone has to pay for that, right? So if Apple's margins goes down, shareholders and basically every retirement account in the world goes down in value because of that.
Sure.
So someone's got to pay for that, right?
So if you accept that argument, that anything that profit maximizes is legitimate, regardless of whether it's socially legitimate, right? So if you think about, if I'm a tobacco company, it's exactly the same logic. You could end up being extremely detrimental to the world while still making tons of profit out of it.
They have a direct impact at killing people. Whereas Apple, as a company themselves, aren't doing anything that's directly impacting.
Well,
it's indirect based on someone that's down the line in the supply chain.
Would you apply the same argument to a fashion company that has the same supply chain that's extremely dirty and polluting and abusive?
Maybe.
So H&M, you would completely legitimize the fact that they are pouring chemicals into the rivers, and polluting massively.
People vote with their wallet, right? And if that was a big enough issue, people won't buy more H&M. Take the example of Apple with H&M. One company built an entire forest just so they can have 100% renewable cardboard packaging and have a solar farm to do 100%. As what company can control themselves, it's basically checks across the entire market, right?
Fair.
And for them to say, hey, we're not going to work with you anymore, that completely removes any impact to change the minds of people at Foxconn. Apple's not Foxconn's only customer. Foxconn does things for Dell, HP, every big electronics company, and they can say, all right, cool, we still have all these people who buy these shitty PCs for some reason. And a great man named Tim once said, you have two choices. You can engage and try to change from within. Or you just disengage completely, and you can never have the chance to change.
That's fair enough.
So that's how I would defend them.
I get that.
And being the man from the headquarters, Foxconn, if I were looking at the opportunities that were given to me as a working class struggling person,
Yeah.
I don't know. That actually, I think the Western world has a way of just sticking on labels of, hey, this is how things should be done.
Yeah.
People there might think it's a great situation too, or like better than any alternative.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think, we try to, label with all these morals and ethics of the Western world how it's supposed to be done. But, I think, who are we to say, hey, this is how things should be done when we have our own problems in the West?
Sure. I mean, I'm in general quite against these sort of cultural relativity arguments because it legitimizes almost anything, right? Like you could then say any human rights abuse is legitimate just because human rights are a Western construct, and it is. And there are lots of edge cases here that are worth discussing, but I get where you're going with this.
Because
So,
look at these authoritarian countries.
yeah,
They have COVID in better control than
yes.
these
And it's
freedom
a
countries.
feature of authoritarianism for it to be a better controlled situation, right? Obviously, again, you have edge cases. Like if you take Brazil, they've been an absolute disaster. They claim to be a democracy today, but my lord, is a disaster, right? And in many ways, it's because you have an authoritarian who happens to also be a conspiracy theorist who distrusts all vaccines and also doesn't believe that anyone should self-isolate, right? So you have always, multiple versions of this. And I don't think anyone disputes that authoritarianism at its best is a more effective and efficient form of government. I think people disagree with the fact that authoritarianism is the more sustainable form of government because ultimately democracy's biggest offer is not that it always chooses the right person, but that you can effectively remove people who do not believe over time. And that's what happened with Donald Trump, for example, where it was very obvious that he wasn't the right president, but the American people were able to remove him, and in a way that you cannot do in other countries. Yes, that's right. Yeah.
On the future episode, we'll discuss has democracy died because of the people themselves.
Yeah, that's right.
And another topic we'll decide, or not decide, but we'll discuss, is America's biggest flaw itself.
Oh yes, we have another massive episode coming out. But
like and subscribing, you might know.
Yeah.
That's what we call a teaser.